for SAIS Rethinking Iran Initiative's middle book series. We're really excited to welcome you all today and to have with us Dr. Golnar Nikpour to discuss her new book, and The Incarcerated Modern. We are going to have a conversation with her about this new book, some of the arguments that she's making in it, the importance of the book and the study within studies of modern Iran more generally. And then we would love to get to your questions. So if you're watching us live, feel free to add your questions to the YouTube chat, and our team will send them over, and we'll be sure to ask them of Dr. Nikpour throughout the conversation. So just to introduce her, and then really excited to start the conversation. Golnar Nikpour is a scholar of modern Iranian political and intellectual history with a particular interest in the history of law, incarceration, revolution, and rights. She holds a PhD from Columbia University's Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. She teaches on an interdisciplinary set of topics, including modern Middle Eastern and North African history, Iranian history, political theory, Islamic studies, critical prison studies, colonialism and decolonization, and women and gender studies. This is why her work is so exciting, because she brings in so many different nodes into what she studies. From 2015 to 2017, Dr. Nikpour was a A.W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And a year later, she served as a Neubauer Junior Research Fellow at the Crown Center for the Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. Her research has been supported by the Social Science Research Council, the Mellon Foundation, and the Whitting Foundation. And her writing has appeared in comparative studies of South Asia, Africa, and Middle East, Humanity, and International Journal of Human Rights, Humanitarianism and Development, IJMIS, and many, many others. She's also written for the New York Times, Jadaliyya, and the Tehran Bureau at The Guardian. Since 2019, Golnar has served as on the editorial collective of the Journal of Radical History Review, and she served as the editorial board of the Radical Histories of the Middle East book series on One World Press, which is a really interesting series. Golnar is also the co-founder and co-editor of Bitarov, a journal for Iranian arts and writing, where she's written extensively on the intellectual and cultural histories of Iran and its diaspora. And her first book, which we're excited to discuss today, is entitled The Incarcerated Modern: Prisons and Public Life in Iran, which is just out with Stanford University Press. So welcome, Golnar. Oh, you're on mute.
My mistake, sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Bajogli. It's really a pleasure to be here. Very excited and grateful that you asked me to join.
Yeah, so I'm excited just to have this conversation. I would hold up the book if I had a physical copy of it, but I was reading it on my e-reader. And
I probably have one somewhere, but
and I want to start out the conversation with, I mean, one can probably presume that the study of prisons in Iran is something that is of interest to a lot of scholars and folks who have, been following Iran's history. But you do some really interesting things with this book. And so I'm really wondering, what started you on a journey to come and want to study prisons in Iran? And what did you want to focus on? And what has going through this research, sort of, where did you start from, and where has it led you, and what the book has become?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nagashan. So the book started as first as a master's thesis, and then as my PhD dissertation, in a very, very different form, of course. Early on, as a graduate student, my thinking on prisons was probably not entirely unlike what many folks in Iranian studies or Iranians in general understand, which is that prisons and incarceration has been an extremely important part of the story of Iran's modern political history, insofar as both before and after the revolution, the experience of incarceration for political dissidents was and is all too common. And there is a kind of common sense that has developed from those experiences, where people know things about prisons, even if they haven't encountered them or been inside of them themselves, from reading prison memoirs, from hearing stories from formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated dissidents, and from knowing something about the way that the government sort of treats its political opposition. That was really the initial germ of the idea, was to think about the ways in which public and political culture has been shaped by these experiences of incarceration. The book, as I was doing the research for the book, it was really important to me to try to bring in materials that hadn't been looked at before. There's already been a wealth of really important scholarship on torture, on forced confessions, on political incarceration by, giants in the field like Ervand Abrahamian and others who have done such important work, and that I didn't want to. I mean, I didn't want to just reiterate things that they had already found, or sort of just say, okay, yeah, here's a little bit more of that. But I didn't exactly know where the research would take me. As I dove into the material, I came to realize that, okay, one of the things that I really want to look at is incarceration beyond that of political dissidents, because throughout Iran's modern history into the current day, the overwhelming majority of people who are incarcerated or jailed for any reason are on on common law um, um, charges, and the vast majority of those are on fairly low level drug charges. So in the first place, it seemed to me that the story of Iran's prisons had been told to some extent incompletely and wasn't looking quite as closely at those prisoners who we refer to in Persian as ordinary prisoners, Zandaniya Adi, but we can talk about as common law prisoners, people who are not being incarcerated on ostensibly sort of on reasons having to do with their political activity. Once I started sort of actually doing the research, though, it occurred to me that what I was most interested in was not just what happens in these jails, not just how people are treated, not just the lived experience of these facilities, but how the modern prison gets entrenched so quickly and so deeply in Iranian society over a fairly short period of time. So the first modern jailing facilities are built in Iran in the 1910s and 20s. And even by the late 1920s, there's only a few hundred people in these jailing facilities in Tehran, which is where most people are being jailed at that point. Today, just about 100 years later, Iran is one of the most heavily carceral states in the world per capita. The official numbers have it at about 250,000 prisoners in about 270 official jails and prisons, although those numbers are certainly undercounts for a whole host of reasons I can explain if you're interested. That's a huge change. And it's not only the people who are actually incarcerated that are experiencing that change, but once modern centralization of law happens, once people understand themselves to be surveilled and in a sort of centralized legal apparatus, once there are police on the streets telling, distinguishing between lawful and unlawful, that's actually a change that everyone's experiencing. The public sphere is being policed and surveilled in new ways. By the 1960s, the government of Iran avows to have close to 5 million fingerprints on file. This is a huge surveillance state. That's a huge transformation in the way that ordinary people are living their lives, understanding that they may be surveilled, they may be policed, they may be punished, they may be imprisoned for a whole host of different activities. So that became the really driving question of the research once I started really getting into it, and particularly once I sort of visited Iranian archives and started seeing some of the material that we have a little bit less access to here. So it changed from a project that was really about the kind of questions that have animated prison studies in Iranian studies until this point, which is about political incarceration, and became a broader story about the sort of making and entrenchment of the carceral state, meaning the entire apparatus of prisons, particularly prisons in what I studied, but understanding prisons to be linked to systems of surveillance and policing more broadly.
Yeah, and that's what I found so exciting about your book, is that it treats the Iranian case very seriously in and of itself, but it links it to broader patterns of incarceration and carceral societies more broadly as a global phenomenon. I teach a class on Iran at SAIS, and we go through like the different sort of iterations of how Iran is studied, especially in the post-revolutionary sphere. And one of the students asked me recently, like, what are examples of the new generations and like what they're looking at, the scholarship. And your book is really one of them, where it's refusing to take Iran as this exceptional or special or odd or whatever kind of like adjective we want to put on it, whether in the positive or negative, but something that is unique that needs to be studied in a particular way. And what you're actually doing with this book is saying, look at how this carceral state develops within a broader logic of carceral, the way in which we condition and develop societies and political projects as something that is carceral on a global stage.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much. That it means a lot to me that you see that's really undergirding sort of philosophical intervention of the book, and really that comes from the material itself. It's a suspicion that I had, but until I saw the material, until I really went through the archive closely, I didn't have a sense of just how deeply interlinked some of these histories were. Yeah, I don't say it outright in the book in these terms exactly, but I think of the project and my sort of general intellectual inclinations towards Iran as wanting to write against either explicit or implicit forms of, for lack of a better term, Iranian exceptionalism. As you say, both bad and good. Both the idea that there is, I mean, in typically in the Euro-American scholarly or broader public discourse on Iran, there's this idea that insofar as it is a authoritarian state and uses political violence, it does so in an exceptional or particularly historically, historically unique way. And I think that that's a dangerous argument, particularly if we take seriously the idea that we would like to see a a more just or more free Iran, right? We have to actually understand, in my view, the reasons why we are where we are today, both in Iran and globally, right? So it's about trying to think historically about the conditions that have led to, as I said, Iran being one of the most heavily carceral states in the world. So as I went through the material, and as I went through the archive, first of all, the archive itself is extraordinarily um, transnational. I visited archives and did research in the US, across the US, public and private archives alike, in Europe, including in the UK, in Amsterdam, and also for a fairly long period of time in the Islamic Republic, the archives of the Islamic Republic. And I found different materials in all those places. Um, One of the things that I found and that I really didn't have a sense of before I did the research was just how important prisons were to the 20th century Iranian government, the Pahlavi government, first under Reza Shah and then under Mohammad Reza Shah, how important it was for that government to reform the sort of punishment structures of what came before towards what were then considered the most, not only the most cutting edge punishment technologies, i.e. these new modern prisons, but what were really being touted by the broader global community, including the academic community. So criminologists play a really big role in the book. The broader academic and state level community, to say that prisons are in fact the most humane, the most sort of civilized, the most progressive form of punishment in the world, that they are the institutional mechanism by which the rule of law can really be sort of adjudicated in any given space. And first under Reza Shah and then under Mohammad Reza Shah, there is this real, I mean, they put their money there, right? They say, we are going to go to these global conferences on policing and prisons. We're going to send statesmen and police officers and prison officials to these global conferences to learn about how to best sort of what are best practices and best techniques. And what I found particularly interesting is that the Islamic Republic does something similar. If you look at the Islamic Republic prisons organization, they publish an enormous amount of scholarship on best practices for dealing with, let's say, viral outbreaks in prisons, or how to best reform prisoners to being sort of more members of society who are contributing members of society. And they publish that scholarship with scholars from all over the world. Now their global sort of links are not to the Euro-American Academy the way that their predecessors were, but they publish scholarship with scholars from all over Asia, all over the global South, and in a way that's clearly showing that they're also invested in presenting their prisons, however big of a gap there is between this presentation and reality. They're invested in presenting their prisons as something that helps Iran, something that can help change bad criminals into good citizens, something that can change antisocial or socially sort of irresponsible or dangerous elements into socially responsible, good Islamic citizens. So yeah, this is a global story. It's one with a lot of there are many comparable examples, and prison studies has known this for a long time. So scholars like Frank Dickhoter, who works on China, or scholars of prisons who work on Latin America, have long noted that the penitentiary model, the idea of doing penance, changing yourself as a person into a more sort of responsible person, has long been at the heart of the global prison, the expansion of prisons around the world, and Iran is part of that story. And I wanted to tell it as a kind of global story.
Yeah, and part of what you're doing in the book is, you start from the late Qajar period and you go into the present period, and how at least the way I read it, is one of the things that you're doing is you're showing how in order to become this modern state, in order to sort of be this nation state that is progressing, incarcerality is central to that. Creating these prison systems, creating this kind of punishment that is on par with global standards of how it is being developed in other nations, is something that is a metric that is constantly, whether with the pre-revolutionary state or the post or the monarchies of the late Qajar period and Pahlavis or the Islamic Republic, is very much at the heart of the entire state project that they're building. And I think part of what you said really embeds itself within that in the story that you're telling in this book. One of the things that I also found interesting, and I would love to hear more from you on, is, as someone who has read this kind of literature in the non-Iran sphere, something that I had is always sort of in that literature is how much the carceral states in countries, for lack of a better term, sort of like the global South, develop out of colonialism and the experiences of colonialism. And part of my question to myself was always like, okay, well, I wonder what this history is like in Iran, because it was never formally colonized. I found the answers in your book, but I would love for you to expand on that a little bit, and this idea. Well, first of all, is that even correct to sort of think about the creation of this carceral state, or sort of the seeds of it that come out of Iran's relationship with greater powers, greater colonial powers, that even though never directly colonized, but still had a very large role and influence in the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually a big question I had for myself. I think for those of us who are as scholars or as thinkers, we read post-colonial theory, we read histories of colonial spaces and post-colonial state building. The Iranian case is a little different, right? Because Iran is never formally colonized, but it does have a kind of colonial relationship to the great powers. It loses territory. There's this history of economic exploitation and political pressure that we have to take seriously as a kind of imbalance in power. So how does that work for the prison system? That actually was the question I wanted to answer in a kind of direct way for myself and for my readers. There's a couple of pieces to that. I would say that colonialism and the absorption of Iran into a kind of into structures and systems of global capitalism in unequal ways is absolutely a part of the story of modern carcerality in Iran. But you're absolutely right that it's simply a different type of history than the ones you see for instance, in many African contexts or in other directly colonized spaces, where when colonial powers are building their own prisons in indirect rule, you often have a situation where, well, there are many examples, for instance, across Africa, of those prisons being used to essentially produce kind of quasi-enslaved labor. They become labor camps. They are producing a great deal of wealth for the colonial powers, or they're places where the colonial powers sort of impose certain kinds of very brutal examples, very brutal examples of their power in those locales. In Iran, that doesn't happen, and the people who are building the prisons, it is a sovereign state that is building these prisons, particularly really starting under Reza Shah. It starts a little bit earlier. There are some kind of examples of modern prisons built just before Reza Shah's rule, but the project of modern carcerality really is sort of entrenched and expanded under Reza Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah, and then again the Islamic Republic. So these three moments of great expansion. And the story is directly linked to Reza Shah's desire to place Iran in where he believes that it belongs in this kind of alongside what he wants its peers to be, which are the European powers. But he also has to prove, because in 1928, the Reza Shah government abrogates capitulations, meaning for the first time that foreign nationals, European or American nationals, if they're charged of a crime in Iran, they will be privy to the Iranian justice system, right? So in fact, American diplomats and European diplomats demand to see the new prisons that are being built. If we're going to be, their thinking is, if our nationals are going to possibly be held in these facilities, we have to determine that they're up to snuff. So you have this really interesting archival evidence of American diplomats going to these facilities and saying, okay, this is okay. We think that this is up to snuff. So you feel from the late Qajar period into the Pahlavi period, this deep, what I call civilizational anxiety. And really, I'm building on the scholarship of so many historians that come before me that have really made the compelling case that in the Qajar era, nationalists, reformists of sort of varying political stripes are all linked by this obsession with the rule of law. Hadi Enayat, the great legal scholar, calls it the legal fetishism of this era, this belief among a sort of whole host of reformists and nationalists that the rule of law will cure what ails Iran. So the question they're trying to answer is, why have we fallen behind the European powers? Why are we being economically exploited? Why are we being carved up? Why are we losing territory? Why are we losing wars? And the answer they come up with is that we need to have the rule of law, that Qajar state is absolutist and it's irrational in its application of law, and that we need to sort of modernize and centralize law. Well, what comes with that? What comes with that is modern prisons. That is the part of the equation that I'm trying to sort of make a little bit clearer in the historiography. As soon as this centralization of law happens in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, there is this concerted effort to build these new prisons. And as I say, Reza Shah sends all of these statesmen and law enforcement officials to Europe to go to these penal conferences with the International Penal Commission. But what those people are saying, these British and European criminologists and prison officials are saying is our prison conferences and the way that we're promoting prison policies particularly to the global south, is it's expanding, and this is the exact language that they're using, it's expanding the circle of humanity. So you have to imagine that these are people who are thinking that the circle of humanity doesn't include all humans, but it does include those humans eventually, increasingly like Iran, who have modern legal systems and modern prisons, that is a kind of positive reform away from the sorts of brutal public punishments that are prevalent all over the world, not just in Iran, but all over the world, including in Europe before the modern era, before the sort of modern carceral era.
That's incredible. Sorry, that what you just said, so basically the what gets counted as humans are humans in bondage.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. Because you have to understand that from their perspective, what happened, and this is something that I really try to drive home in the book, we have to understand that both the Pahlavi government and the Islamic Republic government, for different reasons and in slightly different ideological, in fairly different ideological formations, are saying that our prisons can help make, and in the Pahlavi case, they're particularly leaning on the language of civilization, right? So it will make the country more civilized. The Qajar government is backwards, it's authoritarian, it's lawless, it's barbaric, and that is why, to some extent, or to large extent, in the view of these reformists, Iran has fallen behind, right? And that's the civilizational language that's really being drawn from modern criminology, modern sociology, and sort of the modern statecraft in this moment. So the the president of this prison commission, this global prison commission, this British the British president of this commission is this guy with a very British name, Sir Evelyn Ruggles-Breese. Yeah, he says at this conference in the 1920s that Iran attends that the countries that are there, which includes several countries from across the global south, is a confederation, and this is a direct quote, a confederation of the most civilized states of the world. And that the goal of the commission is to bring more and more of governments into the quote unquote civilizing atmosphere of the commission and of its project of greater humanity, progress, and so forth. And then the Pahlavi government immediately absorbs and sort of promotes that exact language in its own materials over the course of the next several decades. And what's really remarkable is, with a short break after the revolution, where there is this kind of intensive moment of carceral violence between 1979 and 1988. In the mid 80s, the Islamic Republic starts to use that language again, that there's this kind of civilizing, progressive, healthy, educational model that it's following the sort of global norms in prisons and incarceration in order to help people who may not have had all the advantage. I mean, it uses a very strange, almost social justice language to say, like, these are people who in some cases haven't had the advantages that they need. And if we educate them in prison and give them the opportunities to learn new work skills and new trades, then they can go out and live much more honest and fruitful and healthy lives. So throughout this 100-year history of increasing carceralization, there's also a concomitant story being told by subsequent governments that these institutions are actually helping people, that they're not only helping people get better to help to sort of cure socially ill elements and make them socially healthy, but that they might actually, especially in the earlier period, they're talking about these prisons as being a way to actually reduce crime, maybe even solve the problem of crime long term. So the sort of logic is that you put people in prison, and if you put enough of these people in prison, then eventually you may not need prisons altogether, right? And that's drawn from the global discourse of criminology in the 20th century. Again, because that hasn't happened, criminology has really radically shifted its way of thinking about these things in the last 20, 30 years, in an era of sort of global mass incarceration. But in this earlier time period, certainly it's promoting carceral solutions as a way to help solve problems like drug use and drug abuse, or the issue of sort of various social issues and social ills. The idea that prisons can actually help solve those problems is a big one.
And so part of the story, in telling the story, you also then pull out and have us focus in on the Iranian Academy and how it is part and parcel of the creation and, more importantly, the spread of this idea of an incarceral state. So the folks who go on into studying criminology, folks who are sociologists who focus in on these kinds of things, both in the Pahlavi era and post, can you sort of take us through that and why? Like, what is this connection in Iran between, and it makes sense, right? Because this is sort of the connection that we see in other places around the world. But I love how you kept living, like, we need to look here. It was great.
Yeah, thank you. I will say that in a way, this is my one of the things I was most excited about as a researcher, in part because it never occurred to me to research it in the first place. I didn't go in looking for this material whatsoever. And a lot of it is material that I found in Iran, trying to get around some of the limitations in what I could find while there and what I could look at. So part of it is born of my own sort of frustrated efforts in getting at some other material, and then realizing that there's actually a lot that if I actually just sort of broadened what I thought of as the archive of prisons and incarceration, I would find I would find a sort of host of materials that hadn't been looked at. So that includes, the earliest texts I found in the Iranian archive on specifically on prisons and prisoners is from the 1950s, these sort of unpublished PhD dissertations that were the first generation of scholars in Iran who are really looking um, at Iranian criminology as a distinct field in itself. So these fields emerge in the 19 start as early as really the 30s and 40s, and others have done scholarship on this. There's a field of sociology emerges as extraordinarily important in the Iranian Academy. And for those who have a kind of relationship to the Iranian Academy today, we know that sociology actually remains a really important field. Like a lot of people who do work that we think of as that here would be read as historians or anthropologists, like they're sociologists. The field of sociology is extraordinarily important to the to knowledge production in the Iranian Academy and in the Iranian intellectual sphere more broadly. And fairly early on, sociologists and legal scholars, which again is legal scholars are also an extremely important field, they are interested in how this new modern state is there has to be this huge emphasis placed on legal scholars being trained in the first place because legal centralization and the sort of modernization and secularization of the judiciary in the 1920s and 30s necessitates a whole it necessitates the professionalization of a generation of lawyers and jurists in essentially European legal models, right? Because those are what are being drawn on to sort of centralize Iranian law. So the legal apparatus needs a whole host of professionals, but so does the prison apparatus. It is I came to realize that the making of the carceral state is a story of professionalization in the Iranian case. It is a major it's a way that people it's a it's a job creator for lack of a better sort of way of thinking about it. And a new generation of sometimes deeply idealistic scholars and jurists and lawyers and people who in many, if not most cases, are invested in actually making Iran better in the way that they see it fit, are entering the academy and entering the field of criminology, criminal psychology, what is called penology, el-Zendan, and they're saying, okay, we need to rationalize this process and humanize it so that it's so important that we turn this institution into a space where people can be educated, where people's lives can be bettered. And that's very much the kind of idealistic narrative that is prevalent in the global sort of narrative of incarceration. Now, from the inception of the carceral project, there are many examples and many a great deal of evidence that sort of idealistic that ideal is not the driving force of everyone who's affiliated with this institution, but for at least some of these scholars and some of these statesmen, they genuinely think, okay, we can make this institution work for Iranians in a way that is going to make the country better. That for me was totally floored. I was floored. You have these essentially liberal academics who are writing books about criminology, who are writing deeply sympathetic accounts of why people, social sort of drawing from what was then popular social theory to say, okay, people don't enter sort of criminal activities, what they see as criminal activities, because they're evil people. They do it because they might have, not had access. There might be impoverished. There might be all kinds of reasons why people do X, Y, or Z, and it's our role and responsibility to try to help those people, right? So you have these figures like this woman, Taj Zaman-Danish, who is a really important criminologist in the 1970s and even a little bit after the revolution as well. She becomes she also teaches at the Tehran Police Academy. Her work on prisons becomes a textbook for the Tehran Police Academy. So you have this really interesting relationship between academic criminologists and law enforcement and prison officials on the other hand. So it's for me, this really filled out a picture because there has been, because of the emphasis on political incarceration in the field, there, this is a talking about prisons in Iran is politically fraught. And I found it incredibly interesting to see the way in which these people, what they're doing is political, and they're working within a political structure, but they're thinking of themselves as reformists, as sort of social workers, as people who are doing, I mean, social work becomes incredibly important to this story, that these are people who are actually interfacing with, that the carceral system is not just the sort of iron heel of the police officer on your neck. It's also like the social worker who comes in and talks to you and asks you questions or whatever. These are all parts of this broader apparatus that is now enormous, this bureaucratic, this kind of unwieldy bureaucratic apparatus that's now quite extensive. And in the contemporary moment, you see it helps us answer questions like, how can it be that the Islamic Republic, a government we know to be brutal with its prisoners, that has an extensive record of torture and political violence and extrajudicial executions, how is it that they then turn around and have some of the most progressive policies in terms of public health, or like we saw during the COVID crisis, the height of the COVID crisis, that Iran furloughed or released tens of thousands of prisoners? That's an extraordinarily progressive action, right? So how do we understand these seeming contradictions? How do we understand the way in which this kind of extensive system actually has more than one face, right?
Yeah, and when I read the first announcement of your book came out, and the title was The Incarcerated Modern, I understood that part. And then prisons and public life in Iran, I was imagining something different about the public life part of it. And what I loved about it is how you make this public life of prisons argument in your book, and how there's like the more maybe traditional way that folks think about how prisons make public life in a place like Iran that has had so much political and social upheaval, and that political prisoners hold a certain kind of space within the political imaginary of modern Iranian history. But you're also doing something else with that argument, which is showing how incarcerality and the creation of a carceral system makes public life in a particular way.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tease apart these different things that you're
Yeah,
doing in the book?
absolutely. Honestly, Nageshan, my initial idea was pretty different too. When I first went into the research, I think I assumed that what you assumed is what I assumed, which is that what I went in wanting to research was the way that political incarceration shapes the political imaginary, and the fact that political prisoners hold such an important kind of moral and political, well, there's a kind of moral and political weight that those experiences hold for Iranians, and we all know about them. We all know about stories of political incarceration. We all know things about the Iranian prison system because of the fact that the sort of Herculean efforts that incarcerated dissidents have made to make their stories known. And I try to make that very clear in the book. That's a big part of the story. That's a big part of the public life of the prison. It's the things that political dissidents have said or done, or what they, and against great odds, against profound physical discomfort, against deep violence, against every sort of brutality that we know about, and we owe those people an enormous amount for the knowledge that we have on those prisons. The second part of the equation, though, I think is just as important, and it's a little bit less well understood. It's the argument that I'm really trying to make in the book, is that it's not the public life of the prison is not just that which political dissidents have said or how they've acted in cases of incarceration, because we know it's not just the writing of political dissidents, right? We know political parties have been formed, new political connections have been made in prisons. We all know, for instance, that political dissidents call Evin prison today, Evin University, that kind of thing. That's part of the story. And then the other part of the story for me is that, in fact, the very notion, the more I read and the more I understood, the more I came to see that the very notion of the very public is being shaped by carcerality. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that once law is centralized, and it's, as I say, it's not a overnight process, it's happening in the early part of the 20th century into the mid part of the century, but as law is centralized, as policing is expanded, and we go from there being just zero sort of modern police in the late Qajar period to a few dozen, to a few hundred, to tens of thousands very quickly. Um, the public space is being policed, it's being surveilled. People have to learn how to comport themselves so as not to get arrested. And this is how I teach it to my students, is that we all know as modern citizens, as people in a sort of modern carceral state, whether we live in the US, in Iran, or another carceral state, we all understand ourselves to we all understand implicitly, even if we're not thinking about it all the time, that we could be arrested at any given time. And that if we comport ourselves in a particular way, we can get arrested immediately. If that was my goal, I could go outside and get arrested in a minute because I have a sense in the back of my mind of all of the things that make me vulnerable to that kind of policing and surveillance. And we also know that some populations are significantly more vulnerable just by virtue of who they are than others. And that's true in the Iranian case as it's true in the US case. In the US case, we understand that to be a deeply racialized process. In the Iranian case, there's also a kind of racial imaginary, right? Like Afghan refugees are disproportionately represented in today's prisons in the Islamic Republic. But we also know, for instance, that certain forms of gendered dress make women more vulnerable to certain forms of policing in the Islamic Republic. So for me, I really wanted to kind of push at this seeming seal between the political incarceration and seemingly non-political incarceration or ordinary incarceration or common law offenses. And part of the way that I try to do that is to say that the process of carceralization over the last 100 years has been a political process by which the entirety of the public sphere is policed, surveilled, and possibly punished and incarcerated. And that's something that all Iranians have to understand. And in the contemporary moment, that's something that is mediated increasingly not only by prisons, but by what I call following scholars who work in different contexts, prison by another name. So things like ankle monitors, facial recognition software, traffic cameras, biometric surveillance. This is all a part of carceralizing the public sphere. And it's a global story that has a very particular way of being manifested in the Islamic Republic. So yeah, just to kind of briefly touch back on an earlier question, yeah, this is always a global story, but it's also always a story, we de-exceptionalize Iran in one sense, but also understand that its history is deeply particular in other ways, right? So the book tries to show just the kind of particular ways that the Islamic Republic is using these global technologies also to further carceralize the public sphere in ways that are addressing its own needs as a authoritarian modern Islamic government.
And in this, in kind of what you said is, I want to, let me see how I want to phrase this question. Like the way in which you're now towards the end, you start bringing in all of these new technologies that are being used in Iran, especially as we saw in the aftermath of the uprisings of last year in response to the death of Gina Amini, and the way that they have attempted to like further certain kinds of penal laws through facial recognition technology, through biometrics, through all of these other things. And that also then being very visible in different places around the world that pop up onto like the international stage when there are moments of uprisings that are happening. And I wonder if, because at least in the way that I've sort of thought about some of these issues in the past and the reading that I had of Iranian protests and prisons prior to reading your work was that there was a lot of labor that went into, especially in the pre-revolutionary period, to shed light on what was happening in the prison systems in Iran vis-a-vis the political prisoners, not necessarily at all extending that to a broader question of prisons per se, but focusing in on the political prisons. But I wonder, in everything that has been going on more recently, do you see like the conversations that have taken shape outside of Iran that I follow closely around these issues have been intercepted and like weaved into conversations around what does it mean to have a carceral state, period? Can we
Hmm.
imagine a non-carceral state, sort of getting at
Hmm.
questions of abolition? Do those conversations come into the Iranian sphere? And if so, what are they? And if not, has an understanding of sort of the carcerality of the Iranian state sort of still maintained within the nation state of Iran? Or is there a global understanding that's coming into how all of these systems are linking to one another?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And one that's actually still something of an open question for me, right? This is a history that's still being written. People are sort of engaging with new ideas all the time. But it also has your question had kind of a few micro questions within
Yeah.
it. So let me try to think about how to answer that, the most coherent way. Yeah, so one of the things I try to do in the later chapters of the book is look at the way in which the government of Iran, has tried to address these several crises that have emerged, basically as a function of the way that their prisons have expanded. So after the revolution, there is a dramatic expansion, exponential expansion in the number of people who are incarcerated. There are a couple of moments of expansion over the course of the 20th century. So this happened. There's a moment of dramatic expansion in the 1920s and early 30s. There's this moment of dramatic expansion after the 1953 coup. And there's a moment of dramatic expansion in the 1980s where tens and tens of thousands of new people are sort of captured in the carceral dragnet of the new government. And again, overwhelmingly in all of these cases, the people who are being arrested and jailed are on drug charges. Um, so it's not until beginning in the late 1980s and especially in the 1990s, prison officials and state officials start to say, "Whoa, there are way too many people in these prisons, and this is causing problems for us. Problems like in the 90s, there is uh, this moment of this horrible HIV/AIDS, the spread of HIV/AIDS in Iran's prison systems and out of its prisons, but where the node is these prisons." So there's this concerted effort. Sometimes, people are sometimes officials are dragged. They're kicking and screaming by public health activists and people on the ground who are really trying to push for more just policies or better sort of harm reduction and public health policies. But eventually, those are adopted. I mean, I go into it more detail in the book. Those are adopted, and there is this effort but the idea that there's too many people in prison remains a kind of crisis idea in the imaginary of up to the highest levels of the Iranian state. So in the last 15 years or so, high level members of the judiciary and above the judiciary up to the leader himself, Ali Khamenei, are saying we need to reduce the number of people in Iran's prisons. They're not talking about political incarceration, but they are talking about relatively low level offenses, and actually even some mid and high level offenses having shorter prison terms, not holding people on bail. There's this big reform of the way that bail laws are adjudicated. There's this efforts to have fewer people, and the prisons organization says our goal is to have fewer people in prison. That doesn't actually has not led to a massive decrease in the number of prisoners, but it has led to a surprising plateauing in how many people are incarcerated for the first time since the 1920s. Like it's not just shooting up. But I argue in the book that we can't understand this as decarceralization. We cannot think of this as something that is decreasing the reach of the carceral state because they specifically use what they use to the mechanisms by which the government reduces the number of people in prison is precisely carceral methods. So increasing number of people on ankle monitors, which is much cheaper for the government. They don't have to house and clothe and feed people in these enormous institutions. And in fact, these people who are on house arrest with ankle monitors have to pay for the privilege of having these monitors, right? So it's more efficient for the government. It's less unwieldy. There's things like biometric surveillance. There's all of the different things that I've said, and it has meant increasing carceralization of the public sphere for everyone. So you have to think about it in the sense that the government thinks, okay, having people in prisons is essentially a 20th century model, right? But we have new technologies. We can surveil and monitor people in much more efficient, much more, actually much more rigorous ways, um, and not worry about all of the pitfalls of holding people in these small cells. So when we think about the release of prisoners during the COVID crisis, that is on the back of 20 plus years of public health officials and doctors and activists pushing the government to sort of have best practices with regards to public health. But a lot of those people are being furloughed into different kinds of surveillance, right? So they're not necessarily being released from the grip of the carceral state altogether. So that's the shape of the conversation in Iran. And I believe that there is an increasing understanding and awareness of this, of the way in which carcerality has seeped into the broader sort of public sphere with every passing decade, right? There is an understanding of that. I think abolitionist ideas in general are not the mainstream of how we talk about prisons anywhere. So the idea that we can have a world completely beyond carcerality is still one that is going to be at the fringes of the conversation, whether we're talking about Iran or the US. But it's increasingly, just as it's an idea with increasing purchase in the US Academy, you see iterations of that in conversations in Iran, albeit not necessarily using that language. And that's something that I talk about in the book, is that I really don't know if that language travels well, because abolition as a logic and as a political ethos draws its moral force and its political and historical sort of trajectory from the long effort to abolish transatlantic slavery. It is rooted in a certain kind of historical experience that isn't transferable. And the Iranian experience isn't transferable in whole around the world either. But I have seen increasing efforts to make connections between these different forms of surveillance, punishment, and so forth in the Iranian case, and an understanding and awareness on the part of political dissidents, more recent writing by political dissidents, that shows, okay, we did already have a revolution that at least nominally talked about ending torture and political incarceration, and instead have seen only an increase in those things. So there's a kind of understanding and awareness rooted in the history of Iran's particular experience, that from which intellectuals and activists have drawn to say that, okay, we need a different kind of model, a different way of thinking. I think that that's still an open question, though, where that will lead, right? Because it's an organic process that we're still seeing. And I think that part of the particularity of the Iranian case is also drawn from the fact that it seems, and I think that this is something other scholars say as well, that the reformist idiom that is ushered in spectacularly in the late 1990s with the election of Khatami has really exhausted itself, right? If we think of Khatami's rise as the beginning of the reformist era, in large part, I think the uprisings around the murder of Gina Amini is very clearly a kind of final nail in the coffin of that idiom as being holding the promise that some people felt that it might. And I don't know that we know what comes next, but I do think that the sort of exhaustion of the reformist idiom for many people means that there are now these efforts to think politics in new ways. I'm looking forward. I mean, there are days where I'm not that optimistic, but I try to push through and say, okay, we have to look forward to see what these sort of movements bring to the fore. And the last thing I want to say, just very briefly, I know that was kind of long-winded, but is that I hope that the book tries to make some of those connections in a way that's useful for people. Like, for instance, I say, I was interested in the fact, or let's say, or sort of shocked and interested in the fact that in 2009 with the Green Movement, 2009, 2010, Kadrizak prison became a household name for everyone who was paying attention to Iran, for the Iranian opposition, but for all of us in the broader diaspora who are also just paying attention to Iranian politics, right? And I came to learn that there had been movement of advocates who were linked to, family members of prisoners who had been held at Kadrizak in a few years prior, over the course of the decade prior. But the majority of virtually everyone who had been held at Kadrizak before that moment were people who were arrested in these mass sweeps in Tehran of spaces of deep impoverishment, where there's public drug use, or where there's kind of people who are, if not unhoused, then not fully housed. These spaces of these kind of sweeps that we see in all across global contexts, where people who live in deep poverty are criminalized in very violent ways, right? And those people were sounding the alarm about this space several years before 2009. And there were some links between activist groups, people who do different forms of global and national and localized advocacy. A lot more of those connections actually exist in Iran than sometimes in the global imaginary. But it seems to me that we should take that lesson really seriously, right? That often what happens when times of political upheaval happen, where people are mass arrested, those techniques have been tried out on other marginalized or vulnerable populations in earlier moments. People who we don't necessarily in our political imaginary always think of as political dissidents or political prisoners, but whose relationship to the government is hyper politicized and whose lives are deeply marginalized. So I think that's an important lesson to be drawn, and one that I hope that the book helps uncover, and that I hope kind of starts or adds to conversations that are already happening to that end.
I think it really does. I mean, this conversation can go on for so long because there's so much in your book to like that's so generative in the best sense of that word. And
thank you. That means a lot coming from you.
Yeah, no, of course. And what I love is the way that you're putting in conversation for us in one text for us to think through questions of not just sort of prisons as we've thought of them in the past in Iran, but thinking about the incarceration of society more broadly throughout sort of a century period, thinking about the connection between those who, sort of, are, as you say, like common law prisoners versus those in the political system or national security prisoners, as they're sort of talked about within the Iranian sphere. And it's just such a brilliant example of how to do history on modern Iran that brings in both conversations from multiple places within the academy to sort of think across connections and spaces in Iran. I really recommend this book to anyone watching and listening. And I think it's, both for us as individuals to think through, for those of us who are educators to teach with. And I think just in general, the kinds of interventions you're making are both specific, but as you're saying, also help us make analytical connections. So I really want to just thank you for this work. I know it wasn't easy, and you bring a lot of, I feel like we could have a whole nother session together where I want to like dig in and nerd out with you over the archives that you use, because it was really incredible. But I think on multiple levels, you're offering us, it's an incredible offering. So I just want to thank you for all the labor that went into it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nagas. It means a lot, honestly. It's really nice to be in a position where I can talk about the book and keep learning about the material. And, one of the things I really tried to do was take seriously that the theory, I read widely in the field, prison studies, everything globally, whatever. But I tried to take seriously the idea that theoretically, conceptually, methodologically, what I was saying had to come from the Iranian archive, and what Iranians were saying themselves, in all kinds of Iranians were saying themselves about this institution. And so it's that's what I hope comes through, is that I try to take seriously the need to do really deep archival work on the institution. Otherwise, all of the sort of global connections, all of the theoretical models, it wouldn't ring true if that's where it was coming from only. So so that's the
100%. And it comes through,
yeah.
you taking it, it very much comes, it doesn't seem like it's a book that's taking ideas from the outside and imposing them, but very much one that is showing the connections from like a bottom up perspective, which is why I think it makes it such a strong text.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
So thank you, Golnar. Everyone watching, I hope you go get the book, and that you engage with Golnar and her work more broadly. And I really appreciate you and spending your time here with us today, Golnar.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it too.